Right. Okay. Well, welcome back to our second half of the Lenten retreat, Lenten pilgrimage to the Holy Land. For the sake of the recording, this is the afternoon of March 29th, 2025 at All Saints Orthodox Christian Church in Chicago, Illinois, and the second installment of our two-part series on a Lenten pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Two quick things that came up on the break. One is my wife suggested that it might be a good idea. We talked about Taipei a couple of times, the last Christian village left in Palestine. That is also Father Nick Doctal's hometown, if those of you who know Father Nick Doctal. And also, someone mentioned to me on the break that another point of Jesus' entry on the donkey into the Holy City, apparently Father Pat had made this point at one point, that on one of his entries into the Holy City, David rode on a donkey, and that the crowds would have recognized that. That may reflect the Zechariah passage that I read, but behold the king riding meek and holy and riding on a donkey. So, okay, not going to start with a repetition of the long litany of Cardinal Mary Duval, but I did want to share this with you. I just got this a couple of days ago, and I thought it was a good reminder from St. Macarius as we head into the last couple of weeks of Lent. He said, "It often happens that Satan will insidiously commune with you in your heart and say, 'Think of the evil you have done. Your soul is full of lawlessness. You are weighed down by many grievous sins.'" That's the devil talking. And then St. Macarius says, "Do not let him deceive you when he does this, and do not be led to despair on the pretext that you are being humble. You should answer, 'I have God's assurance, for he says, I desire not the sinner's death, but that he should return through repentance and live.'" Ezekiel, of course, Christ says the same thing. "What was the purpose of his descent to earth, except to save sinners, to bring light to those in darkness, and life to the dead?" That's St. Macarius. And in fact, this afternoon, we will be spending much of our time where that finally actually happened. If you remember, when we broke for lunch, we were looking at one of the Roman Catholic stations of the cross, Jesus making his way to Golgotha, and looking at this dramatic representation of the first time Jesus fell under the weight of the cross. It is time to address a gruesome but necessary topic, and that is the topic of crucifixion and what has been learned about it from archaeology and science. The quickest summary is that it may have been the worst punishment ever devised by man. In fact, that's what the Roman writer Cicero called it. He called it the summum supplicum, the most extreme punishment. 1 Corinthians calls belief, Paul says that belief in a God who was crucified, is a scandal to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. And even today, as I understand it, it's one of the main reasons that Muslims don't believe in Christ. They claim to honor Jesus, but they do not believe that he was really crucified, really died, and that he was really God. Now, we tend to forget the horror of crucifixion. We wear crosses around our necks. They're made into beautiful jewelry. We sing about it. I mean, one of the Stichera, "To Lord I have cried" for Vespers, it comes around every 8 weeks. "Wonderful is thy crucifixion and thy descent to Hades, O Lord, lover of mankind." But in the first few centuries AD, there was nothing wonderful about crucifixion. Celebrating crucifixion, wearing a cross around your neck, would have been like celebrating pictures of the gas chamber at Auschwitz or hanging a picture of a crematorium at Buchenwald around your neck. Just a few examples. This graffito dates to around 200 AD. It was scratched into plaster in a building near the Palatine Hill in Rome. It shows somebody gesturing at a crucified person. The caption is, "Alexamenos worships his God." And the crucified person has a donkey's head, just to emphasize that the graffiti artist thought that worshiping crucifixion was asinine. And on top of everything else about crucifixion, it was reserved for people that Rome wanted to publicly humiliate. Usually it was slaves. For instance, after the revolt of the slaves in 71 BC, that was the Spartacus revolt, all the prisoners of war they took after the final battle were crucified. They had crucifixes up the entire length of the Appian Way, the main road from Caputo to Rome. Like that would have been like putting them on the Dan Ryan, and they were left to hang there and die and then rot well after they were dead. So it was definitely it was a public way of saying, you see that, see what you get when you're revolting against Rome. Don't do that.
In a film, our Lord, the Holy Family was coming back. It probably wasn't correct dates or anything. They were coming back, and it showed a picture of our Lord, and he was young, and he was looking up at all of the bodies that were crucified on the way, and it was sort of foreshadowing. But his look, it showed him as part of this. I found it very moving.
Yeah. Well, everybody knew what crucifixion meant. I mean, when Jesus said, "If you want to follow me, take up your cross," everybody knew what that meant. It was not an arcane punishment. Now, it probably started out as a punishment for disobedient slaves, probably not initially a method of execution. There's reason to believe slaves who had disobeyed were tied to a heavy beam of wood like this, and then forced to run or walk until finally they collapsed. But this picture also illustrates, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but it illustrates the way people who were being crucified, who went to their crucifixion, the way they probably carried their cross. They were required to carry their cross, but it was probably the cross beam, which would then be fastened to an upright that was already permanently anchored to the ground at the site of execution. It probably wasn't, as it was shown in that Roman Catholic drawing, an entire cross that would have to be then placed in the ground. That wouldn't have been practical, and the Romans were nothing if not practical. And they were also highly inventive, so they soon evolved crucifixion into a means of worse torture than just carrying a heavy beam around, and finally a means of execution. This illustrates what most scholars believe was the general outline of the cross. It was probably a tall cross, the shape of a T, not a cross where the upright extends above the crossbeam the way it's usually shown. Though if there was an upright piece nailed above there, it was probably nailed there to hold the titulum, the signboard identifying the victim and what he had done, like this mock-up of here, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in 3 languages. The cross was close to the ground. Now that's illustrated in most Orthodox iconography. It's certainly shown. This is a painting from the monastery of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. It wasn't way up in the air like many Western depictions. Among other things, that made it easier for people to get at the victim. And it was part of the torture that the ground was so close. You remember the people jeering at Jesus, "Let him come down from the cross and we will believe." Well, it's only a step down from the cross if you weren't nailed to it. Now, practices did vary pretty widely. Some victims were just tied to the cross by their arms, not nailed. It was the hanging for hours that was the main cause of agony, as bad as having your hands nailed is. The feet probably often were nailed. It was partly to prevent rescue. It was harder to get somebody off the cross. There's reason to believe from archaeology and from ancient depictions, a couple of which I'll show you in a minute, that the feet were not nailed to a cross piece, and they definitely weren't pulled up and nailed together to the upright of the cross the way a lot of Western pictures show. They were probably nailed for the most part through the ankles on either side of the upright. And I could give you archaeological background that substantiates that, but we don't really have time for it. This is illustrated in another graffiti. This dates to the end of the 2nd century, about the same time as the other one. That shows that arrangement. If you get down to the feet area here, you can see that the feet are on either side of the upright. And this drawing also shows 2 other gruesome aspects of crucifixion. One is that the victim is clearly naked. That was part of the degradation of the punishment. When you show crucifixion drawings with little loincloths on people, that's just for decency, not historical accuracy. And the other detail is this man has been severely whipped before being executed. That was also standard. That was the flogging that was done to Jesus before he was sent to Calvary. And the beating was done very methodically, like everything the Romans did. I say the Romans were nothing if not methodical. They used a whip called the flagellum. There were actually two. Two soldiers would beat the prisoner, one from each side. These are models from the museum at Turin, Italy, where we saw the Shroud of Turin, which I'll show you in a minute. The flagellum had several leather thongs tied to its end, not just one, but several. Each one had a metal ball at its end, so it would do the maximum damage as the whipping went on. Somebody beaten with a flagellum would already be half dead when it was finished. One final ancient depiction. In this case, it's carved into a gemstone for some reason. Possibly this was used as some kind of magical amulet or a charm. It confirms the tall cross, the feet on either side of the upright, probably the flagellation beforehand. That detail's a little harder to see. So the Orthodox depiction of crucifixion in icons and other pictures, like this beautiful ivory, this is an ivory from Mount Tabor, it's probably pretty close to historically accurate. It's a low, taw-shaped cross with titulum above his head, and the feet nailed separately, even if possibly the foot piece is not quite historically accurate. This shows two other aspects of the gospel story, the sponge and the spear. Of course, remember the sponge was soaked in vinegar and extended to Jesus to wet his lips just before he died. Probably also not accurately depicted here, because the Gospels say that the sponge was placed on hyssop. Well, this is hyssop. We saw hyssop growing near the pool of Bethesda where Jesus healed the paralytic. Hyssop is a short, fibrous plant. It's not a long stalk. Again, the cross was low enough. You didn't need much length. You just needed to put the sponge on something and hold it up. Hyssop was often used as a brush. Sometimes it was used as a toilet brush, actually, but significantly, it was also what the Jews used to place the blood of the lamb on the lintel and doorposts every year at Passover, which is just another example of God writing symbolism into history. The offering of sour wine to the Lamb of God was done with an element of the Passover, Pascha, since he is the final Passover lamb. Now the spear, this spear, this is also in the museum at Turin. The spear is probably pretty accurate. This shows a replica of the Roman hasta, which is a thrusting spear. Now, when the soldier pierced his side to confirm he was dead, remember the story, they were debating whether to break his legs. And to check to see that he was dead, they stuck a spear into his side, and blood and water gushed out. That has two meanings, physiological and theological. Physiologically, it demonstrates the hematidrosis, which we saw in Gethsemane. He had fluid in his lung cavities, either from the lungs or the heart or both, which is demonstrating the enormous systemic trauma that crucifixion inflicted. Ultimately, that's what killed the victim. But it is also, the water is also symbolic of the water of baptism, which purifies us as his blood and body keep us pure in the Eucharist. So speaking of physiology brings me back to where I started with crucifixion, the summum supplicum, or worst punishment imaginable. As far as I know, the first serious study of the physiology of crucifixion was done by a French physician named Pierre Barbet. He published a book in 1950 called A Doctor at Calvary. It's partly based on medical records from Nazi Germany, which had more than its share of atrocities. But also he was particularly interested in the Shroud of Turin, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So let's look at the Shroud of Turin. This is a relic that has been known in Europe since the 14th century, and it depicts an image of a crucified man back and front. Now, I took this picture when we saw it in 2015 in Turin. The Vatican puts it occasionally on public display. Usually it's kept private, partly to preserve it. And it's been in Turin since the 16th century. And I'm sorry this image isn't easier to see. Partly that's because I was taking the picture in very dim light, and partly because it's faded over the centuries and it's pretty dim to begin with. But if you look closely, you can see the face of a man here and then the back of a man here, so that the shroud has been wrapped over the man's head, the way that illustration was that I showed you before lunch. No one really knows how these images got onto the shroud in the first place, which is one of the controversies about it. And this illustrates again why the images are back and front. There's a lot of so that in itself is authentic. We know that the Jews did bury that way, and that shroud does represent the way Jews actually buried. But there's a lot of argument as to whether this is really the shroud of Christ. I don't really have time to go into all the evidence pro and con. That would take about an hour all by itself. Personally, I tend toward doubting that it's a forgery, partly because of details like this that it's hard for me to imagine that a 14th century forger would know. And there's also some details about physiology. Another supporting detail, and another reason that the image was hard to see in the earlier photo, is the Shroud of Turin is really a photographic negative. This is a negative of the picture on the shroud. In other words, and you can see it's a positive. That was discovered in the early 20th century, the first time somebody actually photographed, photography was relatively new, and they photographed the shroud. And when they went to develop the film, in the darkroom, they saw that the negative was a positive image. Now, negative, positive, that concept did not exist in the 14th century. In fact, there have been paintings of the shroud over the centuries since then that get the positive detail, negative details wrong because artists didn't think that way. In fact, the image on the shroud is also shaded to see 3 dimensions, so that things that were closer to the shroud, things that the shroud was in contact with, are darker than areas that would have been farther back, farther away. So, and this is a model of the shroud that's in the Turin Cathedral. It's designed for the blind so that people can tell with their fingers what it looks like, but it emphasizes the 3-dimensionality of the image. So even if this is not actually Jesus's shroud, it can tell us a lot about crucifixion itself because it pretty clearly represents it accurately. Barbet, who wrote the book, drew a lot of conclusions, some of which have been proven wrong because he was a general surgeon. He wasn't a forensic pathologist. Some years later, a New York forensic pathologist, the guy who had worked as a forensic pathologist doing autopsies in New York City, and you can imagine pretty experienced, got very interested in the shroud and pointed out a few errors. One error, the front image, the image of the front of the body with the arms crossed in front of him, showed bloodstains on the wrists. And Barbet said, well, that meant that the nail must have been driven through the carpal bones. This actual forensic pathologist disagreed, and he used an example from one of his autopsies, and this is going to be a little gruesome, I'm sorry. This was a woman who had been stabbed to death, and some of her defensive wounds were through the hands, and one of them showed that if a pointed object is driven into the base of the palm, it'll be directed by the bone structure out through the back of the wrist. So when Jesus says to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, he meant hands, he didn't mean wrists. Barbet also thought crucifixion victims died because of suffocation, because they couldn't breathe, because they were hanging from their hands. This has been proven to be probably not true. They died of just massive trauma, blood loss, shock, all the things that had been done to them. And if they weren't already dead, coming around and breaking their legs would be the final blow. It would send anybody into heart failure. All of this does not detract from Barbet's role as having been the first to really look scientifically at crucifixion. The main thing to take away from examining the shroud, to me, is just the massive injuries done to the body that was wrapped in it, whether that was actually Christ's body or not. And I'd like to show you a short video here. It's going to be a little hard to see. I took this with my iPhone from a video that was being shown in the cathedral at Turin before we went to see the actual shroud. But I think you'll get the idea of the details of the injuries inflicted by crucifixion. Well, okay. And maybe I can get this, there we go. The wounds on the head, I noticed the blood dripping from the cap of thorns. It wasn't a circle of thorns, it was a cap. The visage, which is the face. Traces of the blows given to the body. Scourging with the flagella. Chest. Bloodstains on the chest. Blows of the whip. Blow of the mark of the side wound, it says mark of the spear. Blood spots on the back of the hands. Which I have, it does look like it was nailed through the foot, not through anything. Dorsal image, the back. Back of the neck. Blood on the back of the neck. At the detail, it's hard to imagine a forger doing. Wounds of the thorns, this is looking down on the head. Back. Thorn spurs. Further blow, streams of blood down the back. Illustrated the positive and the negative, which actually becomes a positive. All right. So with all that detail, it's hard to imagine it was a forger. If it wasn't actually Christ, it was somebody who died the same death, and it was a horrible death. Now, because crucifixion was so horrible and so degrading, it's often said that Christians didn't depict the cross until after Constantine banned crucifixion in the early 4th century. So crucifixion continued until the Roman Empire turned Christian. That's not strictly true. For one thing, the sign of the cross was used very early. Tertullian mentions it about 200, and there's reason to believe it was being used at least in baptism before that time. And many early manuscripts, Christian manuscripts, use something called the starogram, from the Greek word for cross, staros, or in modern Greek, stavros. A starogram is a combination of the Greek letters ta and rho, T and R, which are part of the word staros, but when they're combined, they look something like a human figure hanging on a cross. Here's another example of a starogram from a manuscript of the Gospel of Luke from the 2nd century. The starogram here is being used in statements by Jesus to the disciples. So the Christians were not quite as reticent about the cross as people say. They only started depicting it when they could start depicting anything, which is when they started doing artwork in churches because they could build churches. Incidentally, one other misunderstanding about crucifixion that you may run into, the word staros originally meant stake. And Jehovah's Witnesses and maybe some other people have taken that and ignoring tradition said, well, that means Jesus was just nailed to a pole. It's very clear by the Roman time, staros also meant cross like this, and you've seen graphic evidence of that. It is not the only error made by people like the Jehovah's Witnesses who try to reason out the faith from scratch and ignore tradition and history. So sorry about all those disturbing details, but I think they're important to understand. We're going to go back to our chronology of Holy Friday. Now, wherever the praetorium was, if you remember that discussion just before lunch, wherever Pilate actually passed judgment on Jesus, and this map assumes it was Herod's palace, that red box on the left. Jesus was then scourged half to death and taken out carrying the crossbeam till he collapsed under the weight enough times that the soldiers drafted Simon of Cyrene to carry it for him. And they led him out of the city and crucified him in what John calls a place called of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. Now, that ancient city wall, as you remember, is long gone, but we may have visited the place where Jesus exited Jerusalem for the last time. This place is under this Russian Orthodox church. Someone was asking me about Russian Orthodox churches in Jerusalem. I'd forgotten about this. So this is at least one more. So there are at least three that there's the church on the Mount of Olives, there's the church connected with the ecclesiastical mission, and there's this one, which is right in the middle of the old city. This is dedicated to St. Alexander Nevsky, and it was built in the mid-19th century. The Russians had a very strong presence in the Holy Land then. When they started, after they acquired the land, they started digging the foundations of the church. And you remember before lunch, I said, anytime you start digging in the Holy Land, you're going to run into history. They encountered history. First thing they uncovered was an ancient flight of stone steps, which is on the left in this old photo. Those steps lead up in the direction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is practically next door to where they were digging. This probably was a Byzantine era access to the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we'll see some pictures of later on. It also shows that, again, ground level was a lot lower than it is today. We've seen that before. But right at the base of those stairs, they found a gate made of massive ancient stone blocks. Now, they built out their church around and above the gate, but they believe that this gate is the Second Temple period city wall of Jerusalem. And if so, it's the most likely candidate for where someone would go out on the way to be crucified. It may be, one theory is that it's the judgment gate, where when you got to the gate, they'd read the sentence aloud and confirm it, and then take the prisoner to be executed. The Russians were so certain of that identification that they went to the Jerusalem Patriarchate and bought a chunk of rock that was carved out of Golgotha, out of the Golgotha stone, to move it in under that gate, right there, and erect a crucifix on it just beyond the stone threshold of the old gate. And this is the stone threshold, which is encased in glass to protect it. This is members of our pilgrim party in 2013 venerating that threshold. That may have been the last place Jesus stepped in Jerusalem before he mounted Golgotha to die. Now, one more aspect quickly on this gate. You saw an opening next to the main gate. This is a close-up of Father Ilya looking through it. I don't think he could fit through there. It would just allow one man to squeeze through it at night, so it was probably a security entrance when the main gates were closed. That much isn't disputed too much. What is a little controversial is the possibility that may be what Jesus meant when he said that a rich man getting into heaven is like a camel going through the eye of a needle. It may be that there was a slang term for these gates, for these little doors. They may have been called the eye of a needle. If it was a nickname for gates like this, and we're not sure it was, it would demonstrate that in order to get into heaven, we have to get rid of all earthly encumbrances. Not that it's impossible for a rich man to get to heaven, but if you're going to get in, you're going to have to take everything off, and you got to slim down. And what does that mean? It means prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. It means Lent. Okay, so we've now followed Jesus to Golgotha. What do we see in modern Jerusalem that takes us back to Golgotha, back to his death and to his burial? Well, you see it right here, right next to the church of Alexander Nevsky is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Officially, it's known as the Church of the Anastasis, the Church of Resurrection, but everybody calls it Holy Sepulchre. And for a place that is arguably the most sacred place in all of Christendom, it's really hard to see. And I don't mean it's hard to get to. I mean, it's really hard to see as a whole. You remember how dense the old city of Jerusalem is. That density means the only way to come close to seeing this entire church is to look down on it, which we're doing now. This picture was taken from way up. I did not take this particular picture, but you are looking down on the church there. The two domes here are the main parts of the church. And you can't even see the body of the church, particularly even in this shot. Closer to street level, it's even harder to see the whole building. There are the domes again, hiding behind that steeple. Inside, this church is pretty much a warren. This is the way the current church is organized, if you can call it organized. It has been built and rebuilt over the centuries, and chapels added and so on, and it's on several levels, as we'll see. So it's not just one neat place to look at, like the Basilica of the Agony that we saw before lunch. 3 Christian jurisdictions share oversight of the Holy Sepulchre and have for centuries. The Latin Church, Roman Catholic, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, shown here as Greek, because it is officially the Greek Patriarchate of Jerusalem, just like our Patriarchate is officially the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch. And the Syrians, in this case, the Syrians are the Syriac church, the non-Chalcedonian church. Well, the Ethiopians are non-Chalcedonian too. Now, if you take a closer look, you can see there are two bishops' thrones in the Catholicon. The Catholicon is the main church. There's one for Jerusalem up top there, and there's one for Antioch. So our patriarchate gets in there too. Most of the current structure of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is Crusader era or later, but its history goes back a lot further, and we'll see that. This is the main entrance. This is the only public entrance. You come in through this little square. And once you enter, you're immediately in a place of intensely Eastern Christian worship. We were talking to someone at lunch who had her only visit to the Holy Land had been a day and a half, and a lot of it was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and she commented how just walking into the Holy Sepulchre, you immediately feel a difference. If you are an intensely Western Christian, particularly an intensive ascetic type plain stone walls Protestant, and particularly if you're in the 19th century, you walk in and you see the iconography, the smells and the bells, and you're emotionally repelled. And many, many American and European Protestant Christians in the 19th century walked in and said, this can't be the tomb of Christ. This just can't be the actual place. And their reasoning probably started emotional, but the reason that they adduced was the church is outside the city walls. Now, Jews traditionally, and I'm sorry, inside the city walls. Thank you. Again, she's listening, editing me. Yeah, that this church is inside the city walls, and everybody knows, and it is true, the Jews did not bury inside the city walls. Orthodox tend not to do either if we can help it. Well, in 1841, an American scholar named Edward Robinson used that argument in a scathing published attack that he attacked the authenticity of the Holy Sepulchre. And he had some archaeological credentials. Among other things, he was the one that discovered Robinson's Arch, if you've heard of that. That's a structure that was connected to the western wall of the temple and ran across some ancient streets. He proposed, and he published this 3-volume study of archaeology in Palestine. Interestingly, he had only been there in 19 days, but he wrote a 3-volume book. But anyway, he proposed a new candidate for the tomb of Christ, what he called the Garden Tomb, which was outside the gates of the old city, and it had some ancient tombs, and there were some holes in the face of the cliff that he thought made it look like a skull. And he thought that explained the gospel reference to Golgotha as the place of the skull. Now, that idea was championed by a very influential Brit at the time, General Edward Gordon. He was famous for military victories in China. He later got himself killed fighting a Muslim uprising in the Mideast. But before he was killed, he was very vocal in supporting the idea of the Garden Tomb. Now, the Garden Tomb is still there today. It still gets visitors, mostly evangelicals. And there's certainly nothing wrong with going and praying at the Garden Tomb. There's nothing wrong with praying anywhere. But the actual theory that it's the actual tomb of Christ is as full of holes as the hill itself, which does look like a skull if you look at it from a certain angle and you squint a lot. But it probably didn't look that way in the first century, given how rapidly limestone changes. And anyway, Golgotha was not called Skull Hill because it looked like a skull. The Skull Hill term refers to an ancient Jewish tradition that the skull of Adam was buried there. More fundamentally, the whole idea of ruling out the Holy Sepulchre as the tomb of Christ, because it's inside the walls, misses the point that in the first century, it wasn't inside the walls. You can see I've overlaid a first century map over the map of the old city today. And the Holy Sepulchre was right outside the old walls when Christ went through the judgment seat gate, just as we saw. The gate in the northwest wall, which you use today to get to the Holy Sepulchre, was built by the Crusaders much later. It's called St. Stephen's Gate because it's close to the Church of St. Stephen, which was on the site where St. Stephen was traditionally believed to be martyred. Today, it is generally agreed, and all archaeologists agree with this, the caves in the Garden Tomb were not used after they had been tombs. They probably weren't used after the 8th or 7th century BC. Nobody believes today that the site had anything to do with the crucifixion or the resurrection. So we are back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In actuality, and I can't get into all of the archaeological proof of this, but it's there. It is probably one, it's like Lazarus' tomb. It's almost undoubtedly, certifiably the authentic site. And it houses the places, and partly this is because it's been venerated for so long, and you'll see some examples of that. This church houses the places of the two most important events in history: the crucifixion, which is under that smaller dome on the right, and the tomb, where Christ was resurrected, under the larger one on the left. So let's go back in history a little bit and see how these places came to be. This is one artist's idea. I'm not crazy about the quality of the computer-generated art, but it's the best I could find. This is an illustration of how this area may have looked in about 30 AD, when Christ was crucified. You're looking in the background, you recognize the model of the temple, or of Jerusalem, with the temple in the background. So this would have been about the wall that he would have come out of. Golgotha was not a hill. The word hill is never used in the gospel. The whole area was an area where there had been a lot of plantings. There were some caves, and there were higher and lower areas, and Golgotha was one of the higher areas. And they were using those as tombs because the Jews bury outside city walls. This whole area had started out as a limestone quarry, and that was confirmed in the 60s through the 80s when they first started doing excavations in the sub basements of the Holy Sepulchre Church. This is a picture of traces of quarrying for building blocks, like the limestone blocks that were used in Herod's temple rebuilding. And the reason they left marks like that is shown in this sketch. That's how stonecutters carved out blocks for building in those days. They would score the surface of the limestone in a rectangular pattern like he's doing here. Then they'd force wooden logs into the grooves and pour water on the logs till they expanded and cracked the stone. By the 1st century BC or so, the usable limestone chunks had played out, and a lot of them had probably been taken out and taken over to the site of the temple for Herod's rebuilding project. And the area was filled with stone and soil and turned into a burial ground because there were still a lot of caves there. This particular map maker has located Golgotha, that's the Greek lettering to the right, and the tomb of Christ over here to the left, Tophos Ton Christou. And if you look at the scale, they're about 40 meters apart. In other words, they're about the width of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they're not very different in location, in elevation. And that's consistent with the account in John's gospel. He says, after Jesus has died, now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre wherein never was man yet laid. So Christ could not have been taken very far to be buried. Now, his reference to the garden, in fact, the most recent excavations in the church, and this just hit the news within the last couple of weeks. I was saying to somebody, it's a sign of how the internet is listening to us, because as I was researching this, all of a sudden this article popped up saying, "Hi, you made me interested in this." Okay, thanks. This picture was done just this year. There's a group in there repairing the floor in the around the edicule, which has been settling and needed to be jacked up. And they dug down to the pre-Christian stratum and found traces of olive trees and grapevines. So the garden that he was buried in was the same kind of garden Gethsemane was. It was an agricultural area, which also had limestone that had been carved into tombs. There are many rock-cut tombs like this in the lower level churches of the Holy Sepulchre. Some of them are group tombs like that one. Some of them are individual tombs. Individual tombs was basically one room with a grave slab. That's the kind of tomb that a wealthy man like Joseph of Arimathea would have had, because it says he placed Jesus in his own new tomb. So after his trial, Jesus was led through the northwestern gate of the city, and Josephus called that the Ganath gate, that may mean garden gate. And as they left the gate, they almost immediately came to this quarry. This is looking at that artist rendering from the other direction, from the Jerusalem direction rather than toward Jerusalem. So this is what they saw. They're walking into a garden, really an agricultural area, part cemetery, And when the Romans wanted it to be, this was a place of execution because they loved to execute people in full view, like we were talking about the crosses on the Appian Way. They wanted people to see the crucifixion and learn what it was like to revolt against Rome. This is where he was crucified, and nearby it's where he was buried. Now, jumping over to secular history for a moment, about 40 years after this, the Romans crushed the Jewish revolt, and Jerusalem was largely destroyed. It was largely flattened to the ground. Jews tried and revolt again in 130 AD. It was the Bar Kokhba revolt. Romans stamped that out too. At that point, they said, okay, we're through with the Jews. Get out. You're not even allowed to be in Jerusalem. And we're going to build a new city. And the Emperor Hadrian, showed here in a bronze bust that was actually found near Jerusalem, built Aelia Capitolina over the ruins. I mentioned that this morning. He also built this temple to Venus, or Aphrodite, on the site of Golgotha. Now, it's not clear whether he knew that Christians had been venerating that site and he built the temple there to spite them, or whether it was a coincidence. But it stayed that way. The temple of Venus stayed there for a couple of hundred years. Now, soon after the First Ecumenical Council, this is, the Roman Empire has now become officially Christian. The mother of Constantine, St. Helen, went on a tour of the Mideast to identify Christian sites and to found churches. Among other things, she found the Nativity cave in Bethlehem and built the Church of the Nativity there. When she came to Jerusalem, she asked, where was Christ buried? And they pointed her to the place of the Temple of Venus, down there, under there. Her son Constantine immediately ordered that the temple be torn down. They started excavations, which uncovered the tomb, as well as fragments of the cross, which is one of the ways that they identified that this was the right place. This is roughly what the first church on the location looked like. It was dedicated in 335 or 336. And from the beginning, again, as we've seen, there were two focal points, Golgotha here and the tomb, or Golgotha here, the tomb here. Now, Constantine's builders, the idea of historical preservation didn't really exist in those days. They were more interested in access for worshipers. And remember, this was a very uneven area anyway, all kinds of ups and downs and caves and olive trees and things like that. So they dug down to the tomb. They left only a shell of stone around the cave. And they built around that a structure called the edicule, or small shrine, to protect what was left of the cave. They also removed most of Golgotha to flatten the floor and provide room for worshipers. In this top of this artist rendering, you can see the two domes of the current church. So there's the big dome over the tomb, the little dome over Golgotha. But going back now to the original Church of the Anastasis, the edicule was, even at the beginning, housed in a rotunda covered by a dome. What remained of the stone of Golgotha, or Calvary as it's called in this illustration, was left in the open. It's outside the basilica structure. This was where the actual church services occurred, with occasional veneration over here. Yeah.
Earlier on, you said that you showed a picture of people kissing the rock of Golgotha.
Okay, sorry, that was not this Golgotha.
Oh.
What you're referring to, that was a picture of under the church of St. Alexander Nevsky.
Oh.
Where they, and I thought at the time, this is going to be a little confusing to people because they haven't seen where Golgotha is yet. For some years before this church was brought into the state that you'll see it now, you could get at the original rock of Golgotha a lot more easily than you can today. And in the 19th century, when the Russians discovered what they thought was the gate that Christ came out of, they said, well, we want to have a crucifix there on a piece of Golgotha. And they went to the Jerusalem patriarch and say, how much will you charge us if we carve out a big boulder out of Golgotha next door and under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? And whatever deal they made, they went, cut out a chunk, carried the boulder over to the gate. And that's what they were actually, the worshipers you're talking about weren't even venerating that piece. They were venerating the gate, the stone the stone threshold of the gate. But on the other side is a chunk, it actually came from Golgotha, but it was moved to that church.
So here where Golgotha is.
That's really the top
That's
of,
actually the.
that's actually where we believe the crucifixion occurred. What was left of it, as I said in that previous sketch, the Constantine's architects cut a lot of the stone away because they wanted people to be able to get in and stand and worship. So what's left now today is just a little spire of rock. We wouldn't do that today. And, you know, in Israel today, if you dig down and you find something historical, work has to stop immediately, and the archaeologists have to come in and talk about how can we preserve this thing, which can be a real pain to the builders, but that's the way it was. They didn't have that in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. They just did what the emperor told them to do. You want a church here? Okay. Everything gets taken out except what we absolutely have to leave. Okay, so I'm sorry, this is a little complicated, but anyway. That part of Golgotha, what Aziz was talking about here, this part here is enclosed today inside the overall church. So let's go into this church and take a look at where Golgotha is actually today. You come in through the main public entrance. You saw that a few slides ago. You turn right. If you go down, the first thing you come to is a steep stairway that goes down into a lower chapel. This one is called the Tomb of Adam. Remember, I mentioned earlier the tradition that Adam had been buried in this place, and his skull was the origination of the term Golgotha, or Calvary, place of the skull. Now, this does actually start to get to Aziz's question, because if you notice that window in the wall behind that altar table, this is a close-up of that window. That is actually, this is masonry. That's actually limestone. You're actually seeing the living rock of Golgotha. Another sign of the authenticity of the place, but also a sign that that the Jerusalem Patriarchate finally got tired of people cutting out pieces of the rock. That's covered with glass. And most of the actual stone is covered with glass today to preserve it, because you have centuries of pilgrims coming in and saying, I'll just take this little souvenir, enough thousands of little souvenirs, and you don't have any Golgotha left. No. As an example, the big chunk that the Russians bought to put under the Church of St. Alexander Nevsky. Now, if instead of going down, you go up a couple of flights of stairs, you get to the shrine at the summit of Golgotha. And this is getting out to the tip of that little spire of rock. Now, this part of the church is one of the parts mostly governed by the Roman Catholics. You probably could guess that from the artwork. But there on the left of this picture is the place where tradition says Christ hung on the cross. You go, and under that table is an opening to the actual tip of Golgotha, where you can reach in your hand and touch the rock. There's actually a little hole in the stone that is thought to be a socket where the upright beam of the cross was installed. Probably was originally a lot deeper than it is today, because again, that rock has been carved off. This is a tighter shot that shows the tail. That table is deliberately placed low, so there you have to go down on your knees to venerate the place of the cross. And on either side, you can see they have put glass over Golgotha. That white stuff showing through there is the limestone of Golgotha, the limestone of the actual rock on which Christ was crucified. But covered with glass, so pilgrims can't take any more souvenirs. Now, if you back up a little bit, you can clearly see the crucifix that they placed just behind that point of Golgotha. This is the place where the original cross stood 2,000 years ago. So let's pause for a moment, and I would like to read the antiphon for the Orthodox of Holy Friday. I would chant it, but you probably don't want to hear that. Today there is hung upon the tree he that suspended the earth upon the waters. A crown of thorns is placed upon him who is the King of the angels. With false purple is he wrapped about, he that wrappeth the heavens with clouds. Buffetings did he receive who freed Adam in the Jordan. With nails was he affixed, he that is the bridegroom of the church. With a lance was he pierced, he that is the son of the Virgin. We worship thy passion, O Christ. We worship thy passion, O Christ. We worship thy passion, O Christ. Show also unto us thy glorious resurrection. You remember that Jesus' first words when they're finished crucifying him and he's hanging on the cross are Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? The bystanders, the gospel tells us, didn't understand what he was saying, but we know that's a quote from the 21st Psalm, which has other lines that are also appropriate for the situation. Goes on to say, they pierced my hands and my feet. So the 21st Psalm is pretty clearly a foreshadowing of the crucifixion. Father Pat, in one of his writings, took a cue from some of the church fathers, and he said that he believes Jesus prayed through the Psalms silently while he was hanging on the cross. And that contention is supported by his last words. His last words come about 10 Psalms later. Into your hands I commend my spirit. That's Psalm 30. And it's interesting, if you look at the intervening 10 Psalms, what other lines he might have been praying. Just some examples. The meek shall eat and be satisfied. They shall praise the Lord that seek him. Your heart shall live forever. That's also in Psalm 21. The Lord is my shepherd. And that whole Psalm, Psalm 22. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and the King of glory shall come in. Psalm 23, and also the verse that the priest says when he bangs on the door on Pascha night after the procession. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? All of this he's praying while hanging on the cross, dying. And the end of the line, into your hands I commend my spirit. Thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth. So what looks to the world like ignominious defeat is actually total victory, as the next 3 days will demonstrate to the believers and ultimately to the world. While he was dying on the cross, Jesus understandably didn't say much. He may have been praying this, but he was praying silently. But one of the short conversations he had was with one of my favorite saints, if it's okay to have favorite saints. And that's the thief who was crucified on his right hand, called Saint Dismas. I've also heard him called Saint Demas in the East. Interestingly enough, I never saw icons of Saint Dismas till we traveled to the Holy Land, although I've since discovered, as we traveled other places, he's also very popular in Eastern Europe. Now, for instance, this is a Romanian icon. This is from a church in Bucharest. We visited that a few years ago. Romanian icons and portrayals of the crucifixion are interesting, among other things, because they always show that the thief on the left, on Christ's left, the thief who spurned him, turned around, fastened to the cross with his back to the viewers. And if you look closely, there's a little demon coming out of his mouth as he taunts Jesus. This is Saint Demas or Dismas, portrayed in the cave chapel in that Russian mission at Bethany that we saw this morning. The mission on the place where Martha met Jesus as he was coming to raise Lazarus. I've always found it puzzling that we don't see more icons of Saint Dismas. Among other things, we say his words twice during every divine liturgy. Remember me, O Lord, in thy kingdom. And Saint Dismas is the only person about whom we absolutely are sure, because Jesus explicitly said it, that he's in heaven. Jesus responded to him with the last words he ever spoke to a human being. Today you will be with me in paradise. And I just acquired, I hope we have time for me to just read a short passage here. There is a brand new book from St. Vlad's. It's a new publication of translations of sermons about St. Dismas. It's called Behold the Thief with the Eyes of Faith. And among other people, St. John Chrysostom wrote a couple of very nice, very detailed examinations of St. Dismas. And I'm just going to quote one out of one of those. So what happened? Tell me, what such did the bandit reveal so quickly, the bandit being St. Dismas, so quickly that he would appear worthy from the cross? Do you wish me to speak quickly and demonstrate the honesty of the bandit? When Peter, the chief of the disciples, denied below at that time, this man, who happened to be up on the cross, confessed. So Peter, I'm sorry, I'm not reading that quite right. Peter denied below, denied on the ground. This man was on the cross, confessed that Christ is Lord. I do not say this to criticize Peter, let it not be, but instead wishing to demonstrate the bandit's greatness of soul and his surpassing philosophy. That one, Peter, did not withstand the threat of a simple girl, the woman who said, "Aren't you a Galilean?" But this one, Dismas, seeing the entire populace enraged and encircling, screaming countless insults at the crucified one. Get back to how difficult crucifixion was. This one did not see the insolence of one crucified, but instead, overlooking all of these things with the eyes of faith and forgetting the humiliations and obstructions below, he recognized the master of the heavens, speaking these brief words and being declared worthy of paradise. Remember me in your kingdom. A lot more good stuff there. I recommend the book. This is the Last Judgment icon from the Church of the Apostles at Capernaum. It shows Dismas in paradise next to Abraham, who's gathering his children into his bosom. And on the other side of Dismas, at the gates of paradise, there's the angel with the flaming sword, keeping other people out until the Last Judgment. And it is very encouraging to me as a sinner that Dismas came to belief so late, and all he said was, "Remember me, O Lord." He not only got into paradise, he got early admittance. So getting back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Coming back down from Golgotha, you come to the main entrance of the church. And again, the first thing you see when you walk in through the door is the next few parts of the story of the Holy Friday. Just inside the door is this hallway. This is a series of relatively recent modern mosaics on the wall. That wall was originally put in to reinforce the roof, but then they put mosaics on it. We are looking down at the anointing stone, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. There's lampadas hanging over there. Those represent all the Christian groups that have a presence at the church. But the mosaics continue the story we've been telling. Here's the taking down of the cross, beautiful details. Notice the skull of Adam beneath the cross, again, symbolically representing that tradition. Then you move to the left, the preparation for burial. Notice the flask and the basket here in front of the stone that he stretched out on. Those are the oil and spices they prepared the body with. Interestingly enough, this section of the mosaics is smack across the hall from the anointing stone that you saw earlier. And notice how prominent the Theotokos is in all of these scenes. And then finally, the placing into the tomb, the inhumation. His face in this depiction is uncovered for the sake of iconography, but as we saw with the Shroud of Turin, it probably had been covered by the shroud. And over all these scenes, there are angels weeping and covering their eyes. I presented parts of this talk at St. George a couple of years ago. And one of the women in the audience asked me a question that initially startled me, but then it really made me think. She said, "Why are the angels weeping?" And first off, all I could think was, well, of course they're weeping. Christ was just crucified. But I realized it's not that obvious. We know Jesus will be resurrected. And maybe we don't recognize the enormity of what's just happened, just as we tend not to realize the horror of crucifixion as much as we should. But what has just happened here? God died. God, real God, died, really died. The creator of everything, including these angels, has actually and really died. So, of course, the angels are weeping, and we should too. Stepping back a moment, I want to tell you about a little miracle we experienced the first time we were in the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this icon is not from the Holy Sepulchre. I think this is from Madaba, but it's taking you back to preparing the body for burial, starting with anointing. And you remember, I said a couple of slides ago, the anointing stone is right inside the door of the Holy Sepulchre. It's right in front of those mosaics. This is the first opportunity pilgrims have to venerate something when they get into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this stone is not the stone on which Jesus' body was buried, unlike what I have said about the church itself being almost absolutely the place, the actual tomb and so on. This is absolutely not the actual stone, because this slab of marble was placed there in the 19th century, replacing a Crusader stone that had been badly damaged. But every so often, even though it isn't actually the stone where he was anointed, it exudes myrrh. with no earthly source. The first time we were there, we were walking around, and all of a sudden we heard people saying to each other, "The stone is weeping. The stone." And what do you mean? We followed them and rushed to the entry, and the entire surface of the stone was swimming in aromatic oil. I think you can see it glistening there. And Ruth and other pilgrims immediately blotted up as much as they could with scarves. She took several cloths home, and they retained that beautiful myrrh smell for a long time. This is just one of those daily miracles, like, the Iveron icon. It's a copy of an icon. Nobody says it's the original. It's not even hand drawn, and yet it streams myrrh sometimes where they have to catch it in basins. It just seems to rise to the occasion because of what it represents, and it's kind of like that's what happens to the anointing stone. Now, past the anointing stone and turning left, you get into the main part of the church. That's the rotunda that opens onto the Catholicon in the center of this floor plan. That's the complete church, or the church for everyone. And notice the word omphalos here. I'm sorry, this is getting us in there. Notice the word omphalos. That's Greek for navel. It means this is the belly button of the church, and by extension, it's the belly button of the whole world. Now, again, if you go down to a lower level, there's a small chapel that is said to be where Queen Helen found the cross. This is another demonstration of this site, by the way, of the site being a quarry riddled with caves. You notice the lower roof, as well as the rock walls, which today are protected by glass. So again, so pilgrims can't take pieces. According to tradition, this is the spot at which the cross was found, proving that it was the site of Golgotha. And here's one of our pilgrims venerating the spot. In this shot, it's marked with the traditional symbols of the crucifixion, the cross, the sponge, and the spear. And notice again, rock walls behind glass next to him. Going back up to the main level, looking through the pillar. This is looking through the pillars that support the dome. And you see the edicule, the small shrine that surrounds the actual tomb. The Greek term for edicule, by the way, is kubukleon, or small tomb. Kubukleon, you recognize, it's the term we use for the model of the tomb into which we place the epitaphium in the church, representing Christ's body at the lamentation service on Holy Friday. So that, well, you can also call it the bier, but in Greek, it's kubukleon. Right. And kubukleon, okay, it's the bier, but the Greek term for it is kubukleon, which essentially means the same thing as edicule. Now, when we first visited Jerusalem in 2013, the edicule looked like this. It was surrounded by girders. That was because the entire church had been deteriorating for years, partly because of earthquake. It's a very tectonic area, partly subterranean water, partly just age. And the British built this girder structure when they controlled Palestine in the 1800s to keep the edicule from falling down. Now, the church in general continued to deteriorate to the point where Israeli authorities actually ordered it partially closed in 2015. And in 2016, they finally got funding for repair work. Among other things, the Jordanian royal family kicked in. In addition to being structurally necessary, that work provided a unique opportunity to verify and explore the history of the Holy Sepulchre. This is on the far right. This is Jerusalem Patriarch Theophilus visiting with repair workers and representatives of the other governing churches. And this is some Roman Catholic monks visiting the tomb itself. Now, if anyone had been in any doubt whether the actual tomb is inside the structure of the edicule, those doubts were dispelled by echolocation. They detected an original cave wall, limestone, up to about 6 feet. The rest of it had been destroyed by earthquakes and other things over the years. As part of the restoration, they removed the marble covering the burial slab, and they expected to find the original slab, but instead they encountered another layer of marble with partially broken. There's a Greek style cross carved in there, probably Crusader. Below that, they found original limestone. This is the actual surface on which Christ's body was laid before the tomb was sealed. Now, of course, when the workers were finished with the repair, they had to put the marble back in place. So if you go to the Holy Sepulchre today, you will not be able to venerate that limestone directly. But they did leave some openings into the tomb. These openings were not there before. So around the side, you can look in and see that, in fact, those walls are limestone inside the marble, which represents where Constantine's workmen carved the edicule out of the bedrock in the 4th century. The restoration made a few other remarkable discoveries. This is a section from an altar that dates back to the Crusader Church dedication in 1149. In 1808, there was a large fire and a lot of work had to be done. And this piece of the altar was removed and stuck in a back corridor. And it had been in that back corridor ever since, leaning against the wall with only its own only a blank side exposed. So people didn't know what it was. And there are pilgrim graffiti all over the bottom, but then they discovered this and they're trying to restore it a bit. And speaking of graffiti, one more remarkable place in the Holy Sepulchre, showing how far back this place was venerated and showing a basis for when Queen Helen came to Jerusalem and said, where was Christ buried? Everybody knew right here because they'd been venerating it for years. Yeah.
Maybe you answered it before, but who, like, under what church or institute takes care of all this? I see, the Greek chapel, I see.
There are three main groups that have charge of the Holy Sepulchre: the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, and the Armenians. And then all these others have rights to certain parts of it, but those are the three main ones that have to agree on governing it. One of the reasons that it has deteriorated the way it is that it's very difficult for those three to get together and make decisions. There have been stories of fistfights at the Holy Sepulchre because somebody tried to get in before somebody else who thought he ought to get in first. So it's not been a happy story, but it's those three groups.
Okay. Oh, sorry. You said Armenian.
Catholic, Orthodox, and Armenians. Yeah. Okay. All of whom, including the Armenians, have been there for a long time. Armenia is, even closer to the Holy Land than Russia is. So they've had a presence there for a long time. So, and speaking of Armenia, actually, good segue, because in 2019, our guide took us to the Armenian chapel, which is off the rotunda. Now, we're technically not in communion with the Armenian church, but they have a beautiful chapel. And at one side of the chapel, there's a door leading to a stairway. And the stairs go down into the living rock behind that you can see already. We're in limestone. They go down into the living rock and they just keep going down. You go down a long, long way down various stairs until way beneath the surface, you come to an ancient chapel, which is today dedicated to Saint Vartan, who was an Armenian military leader and saint, sometime after this was used, and clearly after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built. And this place has been a place of veneration, again, for millennia. You can see Pilgrim Cross graffiti scratched into the walls. And there's a much more dramatic example of early worship here. Father Ilya is pointing to it. On the left of the photo, or that wall he's standing next to, dates back to when this was the Temple of Venus under Hadrian, that Hadrian built. And that drawing that he's pointing to is a very crude drawing of an ancient ship with words in Latin that translate to "Lord, we have arrived." In other words, these are pilgrims who had arrived to venerate back when this was still being used as a temple to Venus. That Latin is very close to the Latin wording of Psalm 121. I rejoiced when they said to me, "Let us go into the house of the Lord." This drawing dates to the end of the 3rd century. Christianity wasn't even legal yet, let alone was there a church there. So Christians as early as that were sneaking under the Temple of Venus to venerate. Okay, back upstairs, enough history. Let's continue to explore the church. This is a shot looking up at the dome that's over the edicule. And the edicule is sticking up there in the bottom of the picture. And as far as I know, those three groups that I was just describing to Janetta, the Orthodox, the Catholic, and Armenian, are the ones who share access to the edicule for services. I think the other groups have their own chapels. But around the back of the edicule, if you go around from the front to the back door, there is a little Coptic chapel butted up against the edicule, which presumably is where they worship. Visitors are allowed access to the tomb before divine liturgy. This is one of only 2 places in the world that I've ever been where lay people could routinely get into the altar area of a church. Now you go into the first chamber just inside the aedicule. It houses the altar table, which is outside the tomb itself. That carved doorway at the back is the entrance to the tomb area. This altar is also called the angel stone because embedded in it is a fragment of what is believed to be the stone that sealed the tomb. The rectangular shape of that altar may be a little surprising if you're used to thinking of the stone that sealed the tomb looking like this, a big disc of rock. Archaeologists strongly doubt that it really looked like that because in the days of the 1st century, most tombs were sealed with a fitted rectangular stone like this. So this is a much smaller door that you would have to stoop down to crawl in. And in fact, the gospel said when they went to the tomb, they had to stoop to get in. Disc stones, there have only been 3 or 4 discovered from that period of time. Most of them were used for royalty. So Joseph of Arimathea may have been rich, but he wasn't royalty. So probably he had a tomb like this. And the Greek verb that's also translated as the stone had been rolled away could just mean the stone had been shifted. It doesn't necessarily mean it was rolled. So probably the stone looked like this. We really don't know. Anyway, moving on to the tomb itself. Pilgrims enter on their knees, and you venerate the stone, and you venerate the slab, and you venerate it quickly. If you stop to try to soak in the gravity of the moment, a monk will tell you, move on, in some language, but you'll get the idea. This burial slab serves as a proscomedia table where the elements are prepared. In fact, the first time we visited, there was a divine liturgy coming up in maybe half an hour, and we were venerating at the near end of the slab, this end near the door, and at the far end there was a priest doing the proscomedia service, and we venerated and left as quickly as we could. This is a close-up of the slab. This and that previous shot, I did not take these pictures. You can't take pictures while you're venerating. This picture took a special lens to get that shot in such tight quarters anyway. And in case you were in any doubt, there's not much room in one of these tombs. You remember Lazarus's tomb, 2 square meters. That's about how much room you've got here. Just about got room to go in, put the body down, say some prayers, and move out. Notice up here the arch-shaped cloth valance up here. That follows the original shape. Usually a tomb like this would have an arch cut into the stone over the body, and that has been destroyed by earthquakes over the years, but they preserve it with that cloth shape. As you come out of the sepulcher, you're immediately across from the catolicon. So imagine you've just venerated that slab, you duck down, you come out the wall, past the angel stone, and you're looking at this across the hall, the general church that all the jurisdictions use, though they're on a pretty tight schedule during the Pascha season. In that catolicon, I had to take a picture of this epitaphion. Absolutely priceless, huge, gold thread, mother of pearl, but it obviously gets used because the frame is designed to be opened up so you could take it down and use it on Holy Friday. Both times that we visited the Holy Sepulchre, we were privileged to attend divine liturgy. During the whole Pascha season, they have midnight liturgies every night. And as you can imagine, they're pretty well attended. When we were there in 2013 with Archbishop Michael, he participated with the other hierarchs. He's at the far left there. Until it came time to enter the aedicule for the Eucharist, he wasn't allowed to enter with the rest of the bishops because there's technicalities about the canonical status of the OCA as an autocephalous church. But other than that, he was honored as a bishop. Most of the service is served in and out of the aedicule, the tomb of Christ. Here's the Patriarch of Jerusalem blessing the crowd. But there is one unique aspect to this service. After the epiclesis and the invitation to partake of the Eucharist, people don't come right up and partake. There is a procession. They come out of the aedicule, across the hall to the catolicon, and that's where they actually serve the Eucharist and finish the service. And I suspect there are 2 reasons for that. One is there's not much room around the aedicule, and there are a lot of worshipers. And the other reason is they needed to get out of the aedicule so the next group could come in. In this case, the Armenians were having a liturgy in another half hour or so. And here you see in the Catolicon, a few hundred Orthodox Christians from many different countries lining up to receive the body and blood of Christ. In this shot, you see multiple communion lines. There were a number of people serving communion. And you can see the two patriarchal thrones in the background. That's Jerusalem on the left, and that's Antioch on the right. You saw that in the floor plan a little while ago. I'm not sure how it happened that Antioch got gold and Jerusalem didn't, but I'll take it. And here we are after the service in 2019. There is a lot more to see in this church. We could spend a couple of hours just looking at all the sites in the church, but we're probably all getting tired. And after the midnight liturgy ends, it ends around 4 a.m, pilgrims come tottering out into the night, and they go back to their hotels feeling tired but blessed. So we have come through Christ's death and burial and awaiting his resurrection. Now that's Holy Saturday, and Jesus' body rests in the tomb. According to tradition, while his body is resting in the tomb, he's in Hades, releasing those like Adam and Eve and essentially destroying Hades, destroying the kingdom of death. But on Holy Saturday in the Holy Sepulchre, something happens that is unique and happens, as far as I know, nowhere else in the world. And I'm talking about the miracle of the Holy Fire. The Holy Fire may be the least known regularly occurring miracle in the world. A Greek author named Haris Skarlakides, hope I'm pronouncing his name right, has published a book that assembles about 70 reports about this phenomenon. This was first published in Greek and then in English in 2015. These reports that he summarized here, the earliest one goes back to about the 4th century. So that's how long this phenomenon has been recorded. So here's what happens on Holy Saturday every year. Now, we have never been there for this. And even if we'd ever been in the Holy Land on Holy Saturday, we probably couldn't have gotten in because there's tremendous competition for a ticket for getting into the Holy Sepulchre on Holy Saturday. It's absolutely packed with people. First thing happens in the morning, the edicule is thoroughly searched by the Israeli police to make sure there are no matches or anything else you can make a fire with inside the edicule itself. Then the doors are sealed with wax, and the wax is sealed, is imprinted. So they can't tamper with the chamber before the ceremony starts. When we were there in 2019, I mentioned how well connected Sasha is. We were walking into the area in front of the edicule, and a monk ran up and hugged Sasha. He hadn't seen him for a while. And when he found that Sasha had a group of pilgrims with him, he said, "Wait here," in some accent, ran off, came back with a chunk of wax that was the seal that had been taken off the tomb when the patriarch went in, as I'll show you in a minute, a couple of weeks before that, 2019. And Sasha broke up the seal and gave each of us a piece. This tiny little piece of wax was part of what sealed the door to the Holy Sepulchre in 2019 before the patriarch came in. At noon, the Greek patriarch of Jerusalem arrives. Again, he is stripped of all his vestments. He's searched to make sure he has no matches or lighters or flint or anything like that. And then he and the Armenian patriarch go into the tomb, and the door is closed behind them. And then they pray, and the crowd outside sings, chants, says prayers, and waits. And inside, the patriarch is praying in front of an oil lamp that sits on the burial slab. And it depends, it's different every year. It can take a little while, it can take hours. But finally, a light springs up inside the tomb from the lit oil lamp. The oil lamp has lit itself, or it has been lit by the Holy Spirit. The patriarch takes bundles of 33 candles, 33 for each year of Christ's life on earth, lights them, comes out, blesses the crowd, and the holy fire is then quickly distributed. It can even be distributed out of those holes. It doesn't all have to be the patriarch. And within minutes, the entire church is full of people holding candles lit with the holy fire. In the first few minutes after it appears, everybody says this: the holy fire will not burn you. People will run their hands through it. They'll run the fire through their beards. Nothing will catch fire. This is a picture of a friend of Creopati's, actually, at the Holy Fire in 2014, the year she managed to get in the year after we were there. and she's holding that fire, and that fire is described by many as just feeling the warmth of God's love. Now, one trace of the holy fire you can see outside the church. At the entrance of the church, one of our pilgrims is pointing it out there, is a pillar. In 1579, the Turks, who were governing Jerusalem at that time, for some reason, forbade the Orthodox Church to get into the church on Holy Saturday to celebrate. So a crowd gathered right outside the doors. The doors were locked. The patriarch prayed, and suddenly the fire came bursting out of this column at that spot. And several scientists have examined that pillar and said the only explanation they can make for that mark is a powerful electrical discharge out of the pillar. Well, they didn't have powerful electrical discharges in the 16th century, except for lightning, and lightning did not strike that pillar. The story goes on to say that there was an Arab emir named Tunam in the church courtyard at the time. He saw the miracle and confessed the power of Jesus Christ and became a Christian, and was therefore promptly executed. And he's now venerated as Saint Tunam. You can see him there in this icon. Now, I have heard a few personal accounts of the holy fire, and they make it clear it doesn't always come down the same way, and it doesn't always look the same to people who might be standing right next to each other. We had one account from Sasha, again, our guide. He lived in Jerusalem for many years, and all the years he lived in Jerusalem, even though he worked for the Patriarchate for several years, he only managed to get tickets to the Holy Saturday services twice. And he said there were two totally different experiences. One time they just waited a long time, and finally the Patriarch came out with the candles and light was distributed, and that was it. But another time they were praying and praying and praying, and then people started to see blue flickers of light in different places around the church. And they got more frequent and brighter, and then they all came together, combined, and rushed into the door of the tomb. And right after that, the Patriarch came out with lit candles. I talked with a priest in Texas some years ago who got into the Holy Sepulchre on Holy Saturday, and he had a similar experience. He said at the moment the fire appeared, those huge oil lamps on either side, those big things that look like candles, spontaneously ignited. And there's many other accounts that show the holy fire can appear in many ways, and it can be different for different people. Possibly the most famous example of that is the story of the monk Mitrophanus. Now, this is 100 years ago. Mitrophanus became a monk at the Holy Sepulchre in 1925, literally 100 years ago. And he was very curious about the holy fire and slightly skeptical. The year after he became a monk, he arranged to be part of the cleaning crew that cleaned the tomb before it was checked and sealed. And when everybody else left, he climbed up onto a ledge and hid. And I read this story before we went back in 2019, but when we were there in 2019, while we were venerating, I looked up, and sure enough, there is a ledge on the other wall where a slender man could get up there and hide. And I'd like to read from Scarladita's book, Mitrophanus' story of that. Once he got up there, he was up there with the door locked, and he started worrying. And then the Patriarch came in, and he's looking down at the Patriarch, who's praying in front of the oil lamp. Then I discerned the figure of the Patriarch, who stooped in order to enter the life-receiving tomb. At just that moment, when my agony was at its peak in the deadly silence in which I could only hear my own breathing, suddenly I heard a slight hissing. It sounded like a light gust of wind. And immediately I saw an unforgettable sight, a blue light filling the entire sacred space of the life-receiving tomb. How restless was that blue light, by which I clearly saw the Patriarch, whose face was bathed in perspiration. And as he was illuminated by that light, he began to read the prayers. Immediately the blue light began to transform into a pure white light, just like that of the transfiguration of Christ. Then that pure white light transformed into a bright sphere like the sun that remained motionless over the Patriarch's head. Then I saw the Patriarch holding bunches of 33 candles, and as he slowly raised his hands, the holy lamp and the 4 bunches of candles ignited automatically. Just then the bright sphere disappeared, my eyes filled with tears, and my entire body was on fire. Well, any doubts that the monk Mitrophanus had were clearly dispelled by that experience. but now he was racked with guilt because he had doubted. So he finally went to confess to the Patriarch Damianos. And here is his account of his interview with Damianos, who at that point had been there for 30-some years. As soon as the Holy Patriarch heard my confession, he was surprised. His face suddenly changed color. His eyes showed an unprecedented discomposure. He abruptly rose from his seat, and with a voice filled with fright, he told me, "How did you dare such an act? To satisfy my doubt, to cast out from my soul through faith disbelief? For that reason," this is Mitrophanus talking, "for that reason and for all the rest I did, I wanted to confess. I could not take the guilt of my conscience." The Metropolitan said, then subsequently, what did you see, my child? I saw Holy Fire, the Holy Father, the Holy Fire. And with every detail I described to him, what I just read a minute ago. With every detail, the Holy Father constantly crossed himself and praised God. And with tears in his eyes, he said to me, "I, my child, saw absolutely nothing. What I am about to trust you with, you shall never mention until I die. When through the grace of God, I am honored with the task of receiving the Holy Fire from the tomb of the resurrected Christ, the following happens to me. If I have a calm conscience and nothing is troubling me, which could have the strength to overshadow my serenity and devotion to God, I am consumed by an inexplicable joy. As soon as I enter the Holy Sepulchre and open the Holy Book and read a few lines from the prayers and raise the bunches of candles, then the holy lamp and the candles ignite. If, however, tranquility of soul does not accompany me, and I am not sufficiently prepared and devoted to God, I do not have that inexplicable joy. Then, as soon as I bend to enter the sacred tomb, I see the sacred lamp is already lit." So making this clear that the spiritual state affects the way in which you see the Holy Fire. Ultimately, what's important about the Holy Land is not so much what we see there. What's important is what we ourselves bring to it and what we take away in the sense of faith. And it's the faith we have every day, not just during Lent or Pascha, that's important. So that is all I have in terms of the sites linked to the Holy Week, and I see we're almost at 3 o'clock. If you are interested, I've got a few more slides about one more special place that's meant a lot to Ruth and me on both of our visits. It's not in Holy Week, but it is in the Holy Land. If you want to add another 8 minutes or so to the talk, 10 minutes to the talk, I'll go on. Otherwise, we can end there. Keep going? Okay. Remember, you said it. All right. The event commemorating at the place I'm going to show you is not even in the Gospels as such, let alone being celebrated in Holy Week. It's the Dormition of Jesus' mother, the Blessed Theotokos. You all know the story. After living and traveling with John the Apostle for a number of years, Mary died in Jerusalem. She did not die in Ephesus. That's a minority Roman Catholic tradition. She died in Jerusalem. The long-standing tradition is that she was buried at the foot of the Mount of Olives, which you can see in the background here. The foreground is the entrance to the Church of the Dormition. And that looks so small because most of this church is underground. This door actually opens into a steep stairway into the hill. And I heard somebody who had been in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre say something like the way I felt when I first got there. I had been expecting to go down into a tomb. I hadn't known anything about Constantine's workmen flattening out the floor and making the tomb right there. So it was a wonderful experience, a very deep experience. Didn't really feel much like I was in a tomb. You feel that way when you visit this one. And this is another example going down those stairs of a point I've made many, many times. Ground level 2,000 years ago was 20 feet or more below the surface today. You can see in this diagram, the upper sections of this church are roughly Crusader. They're talking about 12th century. But the tomb itself goes back to the 1st century. Also notice the proximity to Gethsemane. Gethsemane's right over here. Both times we visited the Holy Land, we were blessed, in addition to attending liturgy at the Holy Sepulchre, to attend Divine Liturgy on Sunday at this church. And as I said, this was more the experience I expected to have, the feeling you're really descending into a burial cave. Of course, as that diagram indicated, this has been built onto and reinforced over the years. Going down the stairs, which are 12th century, there are 2 small chapel niches partway down. One of them is dedicated to Joseph, Mary's betrothed and Jesus' foster father. This painting is probably a relatively modern painting. It shows the death of Joseph. That's also a scene not described in the Gospels. This style looks to me just a little bit like El Greco. I don't know who the artist was. You know, El Greco, the famous Italian painter, was Greek. That's why he's called El Greco. And he started out as an icon painter before he went to the West. A lot of his painting shows that light from within, like iconography. But anyway, this is the death of Joseph as portrayed there. And then you get down to the bottom of the stairs, and this is the church. The stairs we just descended are to your right. We just came down from here, and the tomb is over here on the left. Now, the back wall of the church is the natural stone of the cave, and you can see that. You can also see that window high on the wall. That's ground level. So that's how far down below ground we are. You can see an icon of Mary in this shrine that this woman is venerating. To the left is the proscomidi table with the priest preparing the elements. In front of that is the altar area. In this case, the altar area is built around the tomb. So the tomb itself serves as the altar. This is a close-up of the altar that's been built over the tomb. And on one side, there is a low door through which people can enter to venerate the tomb itself if they can bend low enough. And they exit on the other side. Notice pilgrims in there venerating the tomb, again, on their knees because there's no room to stand up. This is what they're venerating. There was a marble altar built around the burial slab, but in this case, the burial slab has been left exposed to view. Again, more of a sense of being in a burial cave than at the Holy Sepulchre. You can even see up here the stone arch over the tomb, over the slab. At the Holy Sepulchre, that had been destroyed by earthquakes and replaced by a cloth valance. In this case, it's still intact. And this is a close-up of the stone inside the sarcophagus. This and the previous picture I did not take again, but presumably that slab is what the disciples saw when they were all called back for Mary's death and burial, and they opened the tomb for Thomas and found an empty slab because Mary had been taken up to heaven. Both times we were there was much less of a crowd than there was at the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, if you had to go to Jerusalem and only attend one liturgy, I would recommend you go to the Tomb of the Dormition or the Church of the Dormition. The first time we visited here, we experienced one of those other small miracles I was talking about earlier. We'd been on tour at that point for about a week. We'd been doing a lot of walking, and Ruth had developed a nasty sore on the top of the toes of one of her feet. And walking was painful for her. She was even wearing sandals to not rub the foot anymore, even though you don't usually wear sandals into a church. And of course, we were standing outside the service, or out throughout the service. But at the end of the service, Ruth suddenly realized her foot didn't hurt anymore. And when she was able to look at it after we got out of the church, she found the sores had dried up. They looked like they were a week old. And she didn't have a problem with it again. And it reminded us, you know, what does a child do if it skins its knee or stubs its toe? You know, it runs to mom to kiss it and make it well. That's kind of what happened here. The mother of us all had taken care of that little problem. This final image kind of sums up our memories of the Holy Land in general. As we turned to leave the Church of the Dormition, I snapped a picture up the stairs, and I just wanted to get the stairs. I didn't even realize there was a nun coming down the stairs until after I took the picture. I wouldn't have taken the picture if I'd seen her, because you don't take pictures of monastics unless they give you permission. But once I saw this picture, I could not delete it because it seemed like such a good symbol of the Holy Land. Unexpected beauty and mystery, the transformation of a tomb into a church, transformation of death into life, faith looking up from a cave, and light streaming down from above. Thanks for attending. Thanks for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Blessed Lent, and have a joyous Pascha.